Okay. Yeah. Thank you all for joining in today. This talk has been organized by the Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, TACC. Uh, TACC is an organization that's about 2.5 years old, and we are both non-funded, nor are we aligned with any particular political party. Our broad aim is to get teachers at the college and university level in particular, and hopefully also at the school level, to engage with different facets and complexity of the climate crisis. Um, and also through that, hopefully try to get students to engage both with the subject and also politically outside the classroom. So we've been active for roughly 2.5 years, and among the things we've done consistently, hampered by COVID through much of that, but one of the things we've done consistently is to organize a series of talks, and today is the 27th talk in our series. We'd like to thank Jonathan Neale for agreeing to speak today on global climate jobs. This comes in the face of yet another landmark report by the ICCC drawing attention to the gravity of the climate crisis and underlining the point that the world as a whole needs to cut emissions very sharply in the next 9 years or so by almost half to ensure any possibility of staying within sort of not deeply unsafe levels of warming. And in that sense, it's not merely a matter of individual consumption, but as Jonathan Neale would argue, it's a question of rewiring the world. And as he says, it's a matter of transforming systems, transforming the transport system, construction sector, industry, and building an almost completely renewable economy. And his talk will focus on the details about how this can be done. It is, in fact, a very interesting point. As our last speaker last week had argued, we are living through very interesting times. We are living through what is a start of what is possibly a very long transition. This may take decades, but how fast it goes depends on us. And it has a range of complexities, not least of which is the question of employment. And there's not one single transition, there are multiple transitions, and each of them are very much rooted in the social and political and working class context in different places, and whether it's India or the United States or Europe and so on, or China for that matter. And in India, for instance, as we know, a lot of the coal jobs are in central India and now in eastern India and so on. But a lot of the solar and wind is coming up in Gujarat and in southern India, in Tamil Nadu and so on. So what happens to the jobs? What happens to the workers? What happens to the informal workers who work around various facets of the coal sector? There's a range of questions with sort of beginning to engage. And we couldn't have a better person to address these and other questions related to climate jobs than Jonathan Neale. Jonathan Neale, I must tell you, before I actually, 15 years ago, when I first began to engage with climate change, I read his book, Stop Global Warming, Change the World, about a decade or 12. And it's one of the most, as I was just telling him, it's one of the most lucid books on global warming that I've ever read. He's also now the author of his latest book, Fight the Fire, Green New Deals and Global Climate Jobs. He's a novelist, and he also writes plays for adults and children. He's done research in Afghanistan, Nepal, and Venezuela. He lives in Oxford. He's worked with trade unions and other groups in different parts of the world for the last 13 years around campaigns around climate jobs. So Jonathan, thank you once again and welcome. Over to you. And like we said, so you speak for about 40-45 minutes, after which we'd open it out for discussion. Thank you once again.
Okay. I'm going to explain climate jobs, what we need to do, both the technical aspects and some of the politics of what I think we need to do. And I'm going to say, as I go along, quite a few things about how I think this specifically relates to India and might work out in India. Um, and I hope that's helpful. I'm aware that your knowledge is much greater than mine, but I think it helps to make things concrete in the details of different places. I want to start with the situation that the climate movement and indeed humanity finds ourselves in after the COP, the UN climate talks meeting that just finished in Glasgow in Britain. That I came away from that feeling that we we were reaching a turning point. I've been to many COPs before, and in all of them were dominated by greenwash, by governments promising to do things that they were not going to do, and by uh, by the climate movement coming out saying, "Well, this is a step forward." Each time, most of us said this is a step forward when it was not a step forward. But now, this time, the impact, particularly of the Fridays for the Future demonstrations, the school student strikes led by Greta Thunberg, the impact of that has been enormous, and it's made greenwash very difficult indeed. As Greta Thunberg kept saying of the world leaders, it's
Red
blah
dot
blah
in
blah.
the orange circle.
Moreover, um, what we what we've seen is that the leaders of the world have failed to act on climate change. While they've been talking about doing something about climate change, emissions have been rising and rising and rising. And as a result, climate change has gotten worse. And this is true. This is not a political point about any one leader. This is true across the board. What this means is that there's very little doubt now that we're going to have to build mass climate movements to force governments to act or to replace them with governments that will act. That's a daunting, a challenging prospect. Um, but it also clarifies, I think, what we have to do. And in that, I think we're almost drowning in different proposals of what we have to do. But I'm going to try and explain from the point of view of climate jobs how all the things we have to do fit together. And I want to start with what I think the starting point must be. I think the starting point is not what your politics or mine is or anybody else's politics. The starting point is greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are what is heating the earth, and what the scientists are telling us is that we need to get those emissions down as swiftly as possible, as deeply as possible. All of them down by by more than 80% inside of 20 years, and carbon dioxide and other emissions from burning fossil fuels down by more than 90%. If we start with that's what we need to do, we need to look at where the emissions are. And globally, the great majority of emissions are coming from 5 places: making electricity, transport, industry, buildings, and and forestry. That's where the majority of emissions come from. In India, it's a little bit simpler. The majority of the 5/6 of emissions in India come from electricity, from transport, and from industry and industrial processes. So let me talk first about what we need to do about the main sources of emissions, and then I'll talk a little bit about all the others. But the main sources of emissions, we have to do thousands and thousands of things. But as I said, 5 of them are going to be most important globally. The first one is to transform electricity from being made with fossil fuels, so that all electricity is made from renewable sources, so that there are no CO2 emissions. That means first of all, it means covering the world with wind power and solar power. But because the supply of wind is intermittent, sometimes it blows, sometimes it doesn't, because the sun does not shine at night, we need backup renewable energy as well. We need what's called concentrated solar power. We need geothermal. We need wave power. We need tidal power in smaller amounts, but we need them to balance the whole system of renewable energy. And we need very complex grids over long distances to combine all of the different sources of renewable energy that are coming into the electricity grid and to get them out to enormous numbers of consumers. These grids need to be very large. The grid in Texas crashed, you may have seen recently, basically because the grid was too small. cover too small an area. The grid, Texas is 1,000 miles wide and 1,000 miles high, and it's too small, really, for a modern grid for renewable energy. These grids they're enormously complex and they're challenging to build, but we have the technology that makes it possible to build them. And once we've built them, they will be the most complex and beautiful machines that humanity has ever built. We also need, with those grids, we need several different kinds of storage capacity because electricity is difficult to store. So we need to store the energy. And there are several different ways of doing that we need to combine. Okay, that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is transform transport so that it uses hardly any fossil fuels. The key things there, two things are key. One is to pass laws saying that all new vehicles and buses and trains and trucks and cars and rickshaws and so on, all new vehicles need to be run on electricity, and that electricity will come from renewable electricity. And then the older vehicles can be phased out over time. We need also, in addition to that, we need a very large expansion in public transport. This is very important in the global south and very important in India because India, a very large proportion of Indians already travel by public transport, but people don't have anything like enough transport. They don't have anything like enough good transport. So we need an enormous expansion in public transport. And all of that, public transport uses much less energy than private cars. It's much fairer. And all of that powered again by renewable energy. We also, it's a smaller problem for India, but it's a global problem. We need to get people out of airplane journeys, except for the very, very longest journeys, and get them into trains. That's what we need to do with transport. With industry, we need to do two things. First of all, we need to stop using cement. Cement has, in the process of making cement, you take enormous amounts of carbon out of limestone and turn it into carbon dioxide in the air. That's the big difficulty with cement. We need to stop using cement. Everywhere in the world, there are other perfectly good building materials that people were using before they used cement, almost all of which produce more beautiful buildings. And the other thing we need to do is change the heating of materials in industry. So instead of being done with fossil fuels, the heating of materials is done with electricity from renewable sources. All of this means, put together, means an electricity supply that in some countries is 3 times what it is now. In India, it would be on the scale of 4 to 5 times. It's an enormous job. The other thing we need to do globally is stop cutting down forests, old forests entirely, and plant new forests. That's more difficult in India than new forests for reasons that have to do with agriculture that I'll come to in a little while. I'll come to them now. Because the other things that we need to do, the most important of the other things as I said, those 5 things will be the most important. But the other thing we need to do is agriculture. And agriculture, in India, agriculture accounts for about 18% of emissions. It's 0.71. Yes, it's almost 20% of emissions. That's because Indian emissions are low globally. Emissions from agriculture are not high in India. They're, I think, about a third or quarter of what they are in the United States, for instance. India is not wasteful in this way, but the difficulties, there are serious difficulties with cutting agricultural emissions. Most of the emissions that come from agriculture, they come from rice, about 1/7 globally, and rice is a staple food. We can reduce those emissions somewhat, but people want to continue to have rice. Emissions come from fertilizers, both synthetic fertilizers um, and manure, animal manure. Both of them produce nitrous oxide. We can reduce that some But I think everybody on this call is conscious of the political and human consequences of trying to take supplies of fertilizer away from Indian farmers. It's people can use them somewhat more, but people will not be able. No one can farm without fertilizer or manure of some sort, and all of them have problems. In addition to that, there is a deeper problem, which is that in India, this bears on the forestry. In India, yields are going to fall as it gets much warmer. Yields from agriculture are going to fall at a time when population is not increasing quickly, but it is still increasing. And in that situation, people will need more land, as they will in many other parts of the global south. And there is a difficulty, the other agricultural emissions, there's a difficulty in reducing emissions from livestock. The overwhelming problem here is emissions from cattle, from cows and buffaloes. And in that context, the problem with emissions in India is not beef. The problems are milk and oxen for power, for transport, for helping with irrigation and so on. And again, politically very difficult, I would think. We can reduce those emissions some. We can probably reduce emissions from agriculture by half or a third, but we can't do it as deeply as we can with the fossil fuels, where we can almost completely get rid of it. The other source of emissions you have to worry about is waste, and the technical answers there are very easy, and you can cut emissions from waste by about half. For F gases, which are used in cooling or refrigeration, we can just ban them completely. Um, okay, that's the situation of what we can do. Um, uh, the next thing to say about what we can do, though, and this is important, is we have to do it. The reason I've been talking about it, we have to do it in the global south as well as in the global north. And that presents a terrible human dilemma. The reason we need to cut emissions in the global south is people often write as if emissions these days almost all come from industry in the global north and not from the global south. And that was true 25 years ago. It is not true now. In 2019, 62% of global emissions came from countries in the global south, 62%. That percentage has been increasing steadily and will continue to increase, and it will soon be two-thirds of emissions. The reason for those increase in emissions is an increase in industrialization in many countries and in transport and in China, but in many other countries, and in transport and housing and so on. Many, many people have been left behind, as you know very well. A third of India, roughly, has been very largely left behind. People who live in the countryside in China, poor peasants, have been very largely left behind. But this increase in industrialization is not in itself a bad thing, but the consequence is increased emissions. To give you an idea of the scale, we need to reduce emissions to about 1 ton per person or slightly more globally. In India, emissions are 2.5 tons per person. In China, emissions are 9 tons per person. If we reduce those emissions so that everybody in the world is responsible for very small amounts of emissions, we're cutting emissions in India by 50%, and we're cutting emissions in China by almost 90%. Now, to do that, the reason there's a dilemma is to do that is deeply, deeply, deeply wrong and unfair. Because the countries in the global south are already poor, and they don't need to be poor. Now, that's the first thing that's deeply unfair. The second thing is that historically, the countries in the global south, the people in the global south, are not responsible for climate change. The reason that India is poor in the first place is colonialism, as in much of the world, colonialism made India poor. The reason that countries in the global south stay poor in most cases is that there is a global financial and economic system that is run from Europe and from the United States that keeps them poor. For all these reasons, it's simply morally wrong to expect people in the global south to cut their emissions or to keep down their emissions. There is a way out, and I think it's politically very important. There is a way out of this contradiction, because the other half of the contradiction is who is going to suffer if the emissions are not reduced. The people in the global south are the people who are going to suffer most. And the people in those countries who are going to suffer most are the poorest people in those countries. That's not because there's a difference in the climate. The effect of global warming is probably as strong in Texas and Australia as it is in Afghanistan or Sudan or the other places desperately affected. The difference is that in those rich countries like Australia, small farmers are a very small proportion of the population. The rest of the society can, in some way or another, take care of them. But in heavily agricultural countries, the effect on agriculture of climate change is catastrophic, not just for those many small farmers, but for the entire society. So the emissions have to be cut. They cannot fairly be cut. What is the solution? My book, Fight the Fire, about a third of the book is devoted to exactly that question. And I think the only solution is this. It's to say that we don't want to cut people's standard of living in the global south. That what we want to do is to have development, but development on a different path. Development on a 100% renewable path, so that people can have more of the things they absolutely need. People in the global south, people in the global north for that matter, but especially in the global south, people, they need more transport. Ordinary people need more electricity. They need better schools. They need better housing. They need better health. People need more. And so what we have to do is build, it's important to say this is technically entirely possible. I'll go on to say why. But we need to build a movement, a climate movement that says we don't want to keep people poor. We want 100% renewable development. We want climate jobs to make poverty history. And the reason we have to make that argument, it's a political argument, and the political reason is that we need mass movements now all over the world for climate jobs to do the work that needs to be done to bring down the emissions. We need those mass movements. For those mass movements to succeed, to win through, we cannot do that without the committed and passionate support of small farmers in India and China, and without the commitment of workers in South Africa and Brazil and India. We cannot do that. Those people are not to be set aside in this. Though in the energy transformation we need, those people, grassroots movements of those people, will be absolutely decisive. And so we have to build movements with those people, led by those people, that are for what those people need, which is what the majority of humanity needs. Okay. Now, how would climate jobs work? Here, I think the first thing to say is there's an enormous number of jobs. My calculations, they're rough calculations, but I would say that for Britain, we would need 1 million workers every year for 20 years. With the United States, we need about 8 million workers every year. With India, we would need 20 million workers. These are an enormous number of jobs that have to be done. And there are people who need the work. I think myself, I've come to the conclusion after years of thinking about it that these have to be public sector jobs. There are several reasons for this. The first reason is it's going to be government money. No other force on earth is able to raise the kind of money that will need to be raised. These are going to be government projects. But they're also, I think, going to have to be done mainly by governments. That's to say, as public sector projects. And there are several reasons for this. The first reason is, I think politically, morally and politically, we have to make a promise to the people who will lose their jobs in the old high carbon economy, that they can have a permanent job of the same kind of wage in the new low carbon economy, that they will be promised and guaranteed retraining and climate jobs. In India, these people would be primarily coal miners, of course, but also the very large number of people who work as migrant workers in the Gulf in oil and a variety of other jobs. We need to make that promise, because if we don't, we will split the trade union movement, we will split communities, and we will split voters. If we make that promise, only a government public sector project can make that promise. If we promise that private corporations will employ you, everybody knows that's a lie. So that's one reason for doing a public sector. The second is a technical reason. I'm not saying that all jobs should be nationalized because I'm a socialist and nationalization is good and private sector is bad. I'm not saying that. I'm only talking about climate jobs. And here, the nature of electricity is extremely important. The complexity of the grids and of the networks of supply of energy and distribution of energy that we're going to have to build, that simply will not work with a whole bunch of competing profit centers, all following different dictates. It simply will not work. It will simply crash all the time. It can't be done. Nobody who works in the sector really thinks, well, some people do, but most people work in the sector know that can't be done. Not with renewables. And that means that at least that very important sector has to be done as a public sector job. But the other reason is that to campaign for climate jobs as a public sector, to say the government of Britain goes out and employs 1 million workers over the next year, or the government of India the center goes out and employs 20 million workers over the next year. That's a very straightforward political project. And once they employ those workers, what they should do is what governments do when they go to war, when they embark on a serious war. They draft or they enlist all the soldiers they will need. And then they decide which jobs those soldiers go to. And you need the same thing, that the government hires the people immediately, begins training them, gives them certain jobs near home, and then when those jobs are done, maybe they're retrained for another job, but it's a permanent job. If you do that, then at the end of 1 year, you have started the process that is going to take you 15 or 20 years. You already have an enormously popular project supported by all the people working in it and the families of all those people and the neighbors and the friends of all those people. You have an enormous force for doing it, and a bigger force than the fossil fuel companies have. And so you don't have to make a promise about what we're going to do in 2030 or 2040. You make a promise about how much we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions this year. Again, it's politically much easier to follow through. Okay, the next thing to say is the money is there. I'll say it first why it's there globally and then why it's there in India. If you look globally, um, if you look at what happened in the Second World War, what happened was all of the major powers in the Second World War took over their whole economy. They did this in Nazi Germany, in right wing Japan. They did it in communist Soviet Union. They did it in free enterprise United States, and they did it in the British Empire, of which India was an important part. In all cases, the economy was then run to make as many weapons as possible, to kill as fast as possible, to kill as many people as possible, as fast as possible, in order to win the war. We have to do the same thing, but in order to save lives. We saw again the scale of possible government spending with the financial crash of 2008. What we saw with 2008 in the United States was that the Federal Reserve Bank could find $500 billion to give to the banks because they cared about the banks. And they could find $500 billion on a Friday morning by lunchtime. There was a massive bailout for some countries and some people and not other people, but there was a massive bailout following that. But even more during COVID. The United States government expenditure under Donald Trump in 2020 was $2.9 trillion. That in that 1 year, that is in real money, in present day prices, that's more than half of what the United States spent on military expenditure the whole of the Second World War. It's more than we would need to fund 150 million climate jobs, which is all we need across the globe. Globally, the money is there. But also, it's perfectly possible in India to do deficit financing, to run it through taxation and deficit financing, which would be an enormous boost to the Indian economy and to the Indian people as a whole. Okay. The next thing is that's important is the technology is there. The well, when I've been working with various climate jobs programs with coalitions of campaigns from trade unions in several different countries, again and again, we make proposals that are based completely on the technology that we have now. It's true that a massive climate jobs program would create that there would be much better development of the technology with mass production, and that entirely new things we cannot even think about at the moment would be invented. That's true. But it's very important for the political argument that we can do it with the technology we have now. We can also do it with the resources that we have now. This is an important and a complex argument about resources. Again, in Fight the Fire, I devote a lot of space to it because it's not a simple argument. You see, what many people say there are not enough resources. They point to the poisonous, the toxic result of lithium production for car batteries in Chile and Argentina. Or they point to rare earth metals, which we need in many different ways, or they point to other examples, like what dams have done to Indian village people and to hill people. Point to all of these examples, and they're right about what happens in those places. But there is always an alternative. Take lithium in batteries. To mine lithium in Chile is enormously toxic, and it's done because it's very cheap. You can mine lithium anywhere in the world from the ocean. and it can be done with proper regulation. It's just much more expensive. That's why they're using lithium. The same thing is true of rare earth metals. Oh, no, the other thing about lithium for batteries is before 1995, there were no lithium batteries in the world. And some of you will be old enough to remember that before 1995, there were vehicles running down the streets in many different countries. There were where I grew up because other kinds of batteries can run. And other kinds of batteries can run electrical vehicles. The difficulty, again, is there are many alternatives, but they're more expensive, which is why lithium batteries are used. The same thing is true with rare earth metals. Rare earth metals don't have to be mined only in countries where there are no environmental controls. They can be properly controlled, but more important, everything that you want to do with rare earth metals can be done without rare earth metals. Again, it's just more expensive. So if we try to do this completely within the market, if we try to do it with different corporations in different countries competing with each other in the market, then no, in all sorts of ways, we'll come up against not having enough resources. That's one of the many reasons why we need to take this out of market competition. Because with proper regulation, with government programs that are prepared to pay for the jobs that are necessary to produce the resources in a non-toxic way, we can do it. This argument is, no, I won't go on about that argument. And I've talked about the money and the money being available. How much longer have I got? About 12 minutes? Would that be right, Nagraj?
Right, about 10 or 12 minutes, right? Yes.
Okay. I want to move on now. I've argued that the resources are there, the technology is there, the money is there. I want to talk a bit about the politics because I think one of the important things is we always need to be thinking we're going to have to build mass movements, and we start. The truth of the climate movement is that we start, there's a very large environmental movement in the global south. There is no equivalent to the Narmada dam movement in India, in Europe where I live. We have no equivalent to struggle on that scale. But, and that's an enormous inherited resource developed by struggle that can feed into a climate movement. But a climate movement as such, it came first from the scientists. It's the scientists who combined and organized to warn us. And it is the environmentalists of the global north who very largely spread the word. And those people, and they did, I'm an environmentalist and I'm a trade unionist, but my background is much more in trade unionism and in what's broadly called the left. And in the left and in trade unions, for many years, we did almost nothing about climate change, almost nothing. We're starting to move now. And climate jobs is part, above all, of trade unions starting to move to do something about climate jobs. But the driving force has been people who are of climate action, has been until very recently, till Fridays for the Future really, has been people much more in the global north, people who are more white, and crucially, people who are more affluent, not rich, but in the environmental movement in Europe or North America, people's dream for themselves again and again is that they want to be some kind of small business person. The difficulties that we have with climate, a big difficulty we have with climate is the warning. We owe our understanding of the catastrophe we face to scientists and to an environmental movement who don't have the solution. The solutions we need are collective solutions. They're job solutions. They're driven, they can only be driven by mass struggle from below. And that's not that's not who is leading the movement now, and that's our fault. That's collectively our fault. Um, and so we have to build a climate movement by a constant process of reaching out and not just letting voices be heard, but actually building mass organizations and appealing to, in India, the very large mass organizations that already exist of the oppressed in many different ways. We need to have we need to have a climate movement that makes the agonies and the fears of small farmers important, because small farmers all over the world will be crucial. Not crucial. They're on the edge. They're the people who are being hit now by climate change will be much more hit. When we talk about forestry, we have to make forest people central. And it's not about clearing forest people out of the forest. It's about giving control of of the forest to forest people and paying them to do that work that we all need. That's the importance of jobs too, of saying climate jobs, is this is how we mobilize trade unions and how we mobilize working class people and agricultural laborers and so on, how we mobilize them all together. I want to end, though, with what happens if we don't do this, because I think we have to think clearly about that. It's not going to be an apocalypse. It's not going to be the end of all humanity. It's not going to be. You often see it on in Hollywood movies that they're just a bunch of people, one small bands of desperate people wandering around the earth. It's not going to be like that. When we hit runaway climate change, we're going to have dictatorships. We're going to have the tanks on the street, and the new dictators will come in and they will tell us. They will sound deep green, is what they will sound like. They will say, "We have we have had very much too much growth. Everyone will have to sacrifice." And then the truth is that the ordinary people, we will sacrifice, and the rich and the generals will not. We'll have an explosion of, we'll have dictatorships, we'll have an explosion of racism to justify keeping the refugees out of wherever we are. The Mexicans in the United States, the people from Bangladesh in India, and so on. We need to think of what the results of climate change will be. I mean, we don't know how long we have before runaway climate change, the coming together of many different feedbacks takes off. We may have 10 years, we may have 20 years, we may even have 40 years, but at some point, the disasters will all come together. The main disasters are the changes in rainfall, complex changes in rainfall, which mean the rain falls at the wrong times of year. It falls much too hard when it falls, so the ground cannot absorb it. It falls where farmers cannot use it. It floods out the fields. This is already beginning to lead in many places to a fall in crops, but it will lead, as it has begun to in some places, it will lead to very widespread famine. There will also be enormous numbers of refugees. Again, we are beginning to see this. But there will be hundreds of millions of refugees, and those refugees will come up against they'll come up against walls patrolled by men, sometimes women, with machine guns. And the refugee camps, the tents will stretch for miles and miles, and they will last for years and years. And at some point, the governments will stop feeding the people in the refugee camps. Climate change will mean war. You change the geographic balance of power in the economy, and the great powers and the small powers will come together to right that balance. There will be no pure climate change war. There will always be other issues, powers competing and so on, but more and more we will see war after war. And we will see an explosion of racism to keep the losers, the Bangladeshis, the Mozambicans, the Dutch, to keep those people out. Some of these will be old racisms, some of these will be new racisms. And there will be persecution inside the country of the people who look or talk like the people that are being kept out. This this is a horror we're talking about. It's a horror that will not, we're talking about hundreds of millions dead, probably not billions, but hundreds of millions. We're talking about something to dwarf the great horrors of the 20th century, the Bengal famine, the North China famine, the Holocaust, the Second World War, partition, all something that will dwarf those in the killing and the suffering. But we're also suffering. I often think about this in terms of my, now about 4 minutes to go. I often think of this in terms of my grandchildren. It is a cliche to talk about your climate change and your grandchildren, but my grandchildren are not a cliche. They are real people who are very dear to me. And when I think about what awaits them unless we act all over the world, I think about I don't so much worry that they'll die. I worry about when the bad times come, what they will have to see to survive those times, what they will have to do, the orders they will have to follow to survive those times, and the people they will become in the process of surviving those times. That's what I worry about. The last thing to say, the final thing to say, though, is we need to build climate jobs campaigns that are real, that change governments or install new governments, whatever is necessary. We need to do that all over the world because this is a global problem. The air is global. We cannot solve it in one country without solving it in every country. But the first country of any size where we win through to massive cuts in emissions and massive increases in jobs, that country will be seen by people all over the world. It won't necessarily happen in India, but if it happens in India, it will be absolutely could, and it will be absolutely decisive for world history. Because people all over the world will then, workers and small farmers and middle class and school kids will see what you have done, and they will have the courage and the hope to follow what you have done. So we only have to win in one country. I don't know where it is, but that's what we build towards. And once we do that, it will be possible to change the whole world for the sake of all humanity and for the sake of every living thing on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for such a wide-ranging sort of talk. Which talked about the technical capacities that we already have, what we need to do politically, and also infuse with hope, but at the same time, we managed to draw attention to the urgency of the problem at the end, and all of which put forward with a lucidity with which I sort of totally admire in your writings. Yeah, really, really, thank you very much. So I'll now open it out to discussions. Like I said in the chat box, people could type in their questions in the chat box, or if they wish to ask themselves, they could just sort of raise their hands and ask Jonathan yourselves. When we go, Mohit Garg has a question somewhere halfway through the talk. He is asking you, Jonathan, about, it's in the chat box, Jonathan. Mohit Garg asked you about historic emissions, and he's sort of bringing up this sort of developed and developing kind of framework. And he says that you have not talked sufficiently about reduction of consumption in the West. You do talk about emissions in the global South, but much of that emissions, Mohit says, is for the global North. And the standard of living is directly linked to consumption. So would you wait to respond now, and then we can sort of move forward?
Okay. Um, Uh, Mohit, yeah, again, this is going to be a simple answer about a complex situation. And the great thing about the book I wrote about Fight the Fire is I can recommend it because you can download it for free as a PDF or as an ebook. And I talk about this more there. Okay, the first thing, um, yes, you need to reduce emissions massively in the global north. You need to reduce emissions. You need to reduce emissions in most places in the global north, much more than you do in most places in the global south. 95% in the United States as opposed to 50% in India. We need to reduce those emissions, but again, consumption is not central. We we cannot I cannot imagine politically or physically how you reduce consumption in the United States by 95%. People spend much more than 5% of their incomes in the United States on food. You are getting rid of the consumption of almost everything else. Talking about consumption worked 30 years ago when we thought that emissions needed to be reduced by maybe a third. Then it made sense to talk about mainly doing it through reduction of consumption. Um, it's what you need to do in the global north is fundamentally what you need to do in the global south. And that is to use energy in a different way so that all of the almost all of the transport is run on renewable energy. Almost of the almost all of the electricity is produced from renewable energy. All of the heating is done from renewable energy. That's what we need to do. And it does not require, if you do that, it does not require large scale cuts in consumption because you face the same problem basically in Britain or France or Canada that you face in India or South Africa, which is that if you build a political movement based on people in suits and nice dresses going to talk to working class audiences and telling them that we will all have to reduce our consumption, what those audiences already know from bitter experience, because they've been through 40 years of neoliberalism, is that what those people mean is that the working class people will have to reduce their consumption and the people in the suits will not. That's the first thing. It's an argument about consumption, is an argument about the North and the South. And it's it's an argument about the nature of society as well. Here I fall back on coming from a trade union background. In a trade union background, what you want is decent pay, safe conditions, and decent public services. uh, that's what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for reductions. And it's very difficult for me to think of the regime which is going to put through mass reductions in consumption, which is not a brutal dictatorship. And the the alternative exists. The other thing is historic emissions. Yes, historic emissions are part of why it would be so evil for people in the global south to have to reduce their consumption. It's part of why it has to be development for the global south, but development through renewables. Um, the argument, there is an argument that the emissions, the increase in emissions for the from the global south are mainly for production for people, goods, and people in the global north. I've gone through in great detail in the Fight the Fire book the national accounts for China of where Chinese exports go and where Chinese industrial products go and where Chinese emissions are coming from. And I've gone through a bit for India, but I'm not like the same scale for India. But China is the most export, not the most export oriented of the, but it's the one that people come back to most. And emissions for the global north, for production for the global north, can account for about 15% of total emissions from China. More equally important, if the when Britain was the workshop of the world and Britain was exporting all of its industrial products to India, everybody said that's British domination of the world economy because they're the industrial power. If you look at how people in China feel, they don't want to close those export factories. They want better pay. They want more safety. They want the terrible working hours are terrible. They want all that changed. But they don't want to close those factories any more than people want to close the factories in India that are for export. So it's not, we have no alternative but to confront this situation. And we have no alternative but to move beyond talking about consumption. Reducing consumption helps, but it helps on the margins. Doing things in a renewable way is essential. I'm almost ranting here, and I'm really sorry about that because the question you asked was very serious, but I try and answer it in a less ranting way in the book, and please have a look. That's that.
I was muted. Sorry. Sumati, could you come in next? You said you wanted to ask.
Yes. So I'd like to thank you for a really interesting talk. And I'm really new to these questions and these debates, but I did read chunks of your book, Fight the Fire, over the weekend, chunks of it. I couldn't read everything. And I have to say that I really love the vision. And I would really like to believe this possibility because I think it reinvents our relationship with each other as well as with the earth. And that's why I'm saying I'd like to believe, and I'd like to then ask this harder question, which is, what is unclear to me is the time scale of political change required for this. What you propose is a revolution, hopefully not bloody, but one that requires concentrated political action, a sort of new type of international, to coin the Marxist, to sort of use that analogy. And I want to ask, can we realistically hope for this? I would like to. This sounds, I'm an optimist. I'd like to think that it's possible. But I also know, as I think Barbara has also asked this towards the end of her thing, which is that the strong possibility for violent opposition from global finance, neo-imperialists, fossil fuel capitalists, and that is a frightening possibility. We've already seen elements of that violence in various movements, workers' movements across the world, farmers' movements. We've seen it in the dam movements and so on, the environmental movements. So this is a question in terms of time scale, because time scale is at the heart of everything we're talking about. This is not for 100 years from now for society to progress towards this in a sort of a natural way, quote unquote natural way, but you are asking for something that is very profoundly, very, very deeply involved. And the fact that you're involving you want to involve, and here again, forgive my ignorance because I don't know enough about this movement, work trade unions as well as farmers movements and so on deeply into it. And how realistic is it? What is the time scale that you can realistically put to something like this? Thank you so much.
Can I take 2 or 3 questions at once, or otherwise I sort of dominate everything? Is that all right? Or?
Yeah, sure. So Lavanya, you wanted to come in next, and after that we'll ask Barbara's questions, and then me. Yeah. So Lavanya, would you?
Hi, thanks, Nagaraj. Thank you for a wonderful talk. So I have two questions. two questions. One actually harks back to Mohit's question. In terms of the climate change discourse in COP26, it seems like this common but differentiated responsibility has all but been forgotten. So that's one question that I was hoping you'd react to. And the second question is focused on the idea of climate jobs. In the way you've constructed it in terms of the role of the state, wouldn't it seem like a very centralized solution? And wouldn't that actually lead to what you had drawn the horoscope that you drew in the end, where you talked of dictatorships? Wouldn't creation of jobs in the way you see it actually lead or give more room for more centralized dictatorship forms of rule? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Jonathan, you could maybe respond to those questions and then we could take further.
Sure. Okay. They're both very difficult questions. Let me start with common but differentiated responsibility. This is the idea that has been central to the UN climate talks really since 1992. And it is that we are all collectively responsible for what needs to be done, but the global north is much more responsible. That remains the case. And it remains the case that the changes in the global north will have to be larger. But as the standard of living rises for people in the middle and in large parts of the global south, the balance is shifting. So partly it's been lost, the idea of common but differentiated responsibility, but the larger reason it's been lost is that as common but differentiated responsibility is played out in the UN climate talks, it's been a lie. What has happened is that the countries of the global north, led by the United States, have said, well, China isn't doing anything. India isn't doing anything. If they're not doing anything, there's no point in us rich countries doing anything, because if they don't do anything and China keeps growing, global warming goes on and gets worse. So why should we do anything? And then the governments of the global south, led by China, say, oh, the governments of the global north are not doing anything. So we're suffering more. It's less of our fault. Why should we do anything? We won't do anything. The really ugly thing about this is a dance that is coordinated. If you watch the moment in which, in 2009, in which the old treaty, which was going to have set limits for greenhouse gas emissions that countries had to stick to, that was broken. And that was broken in the first place on the last day of the Copenhagen UN meetings by a meeting between President Obama of the United States and President Xi of China. It was ratified just before lunch, that agreement, by bringing 4 more people into the meeting. Lula from Brazil, Zuma from South Africa, one more who I cannot remember, and Manmohan Singh. That was who junked the Kyoto Treaty. And you have the same thing has been happening in Glasgow. There is supposed to be $100 billion a year provided to help the global south, and negotiations focused on that. And the countries of the global north said outside to the media they were doing everything they could to raise the $100 billion. And they said to the countries of the global south inside the meeting, the global north said, no way we're doing that. Just go away. That's what they said. And then the countries of the global south say, well, we don't have to do it. They're not doing it. We're not doing it. This is, at the top, it's a dance. It is the leaders of all the world doing this. And together they have used and discarded the idea of common but differentiation responsibility. The problem of jobs, I don't think that um, centralized jobs, that nationalized industries of themselves lead to dictatorship. There were very large levels of nationalized industry after in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. Some countries dictatorship, some countries not dictatorship. There is a problem, I think, it's a technical problem which encourages centralization. That um, local urban transport systems are better run from the city. Whole systems of renewable energy. It may not have to be run on a whole India India-wide scale, but it certainly is has to be run on a very wide regional scale for it to work. There are exceptions to that, but this is part and and I think the threat of the dictatorships that await us if we don't do that are very big. That's a partial answer to that. Sumati's question, I, I've gone on too long. I want to take a little bit of your question and I want to come back with the rest of it. Um, yeah, we've seen violence, and we've seen escalated violence. Some places the relationships are direct. The violence in South Africa, particularly the violence against immigrants in South Africa that we saw recently, uh, but the general violence that has everything to do with an environmental catastrophe, with the way that the governments of the world handled COVID. There are wars, long running wars, and small wars, big wars in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Chad, in Mali, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in northern Kenya that have an enormous amount to do with climate change. In Darfur and Chad, what you're seeing is poor farmers and poor herders killing each other for disappearing grass and water. Um, that level of violence is going to increase. You can see in Afghanistan right now a major climate change famine developing, which is going to bring in its wake very considerable violence, I think. And you will get, if people simply react to the destruction of their livelihood with no alternative for their livelihood, you will get terrible violence as well. I think that's why we're fighting for climate jobs, so that does not happen. On the large,
Can I clarify? Sorry,
sure,
Jonathan, maybe
sure,
just to
yes,
say,
please.
I was worrying, I was also talking about the violence from the imperialists and from the neoliberal economy, from the people who have the weapons who
Oh
fight
yes.
these weapons. So that's what I'm, that's what
Oh
I'm
God,
more.
yes, God, yes. Okay, on that scale, massive. I mean, the most obvious thing is there is an explosion. There's been an explosion of mass movements in many parts of the world now for democracy, where there are dictatorships, for parliamentary democracy, where there is parliamentary democracy for deeper and more real democracy, more real people's power. You've seen them, you see it in many different countries in the world. You see these kinds of uprising and mass movements beginning now. And then you look at the heartland of this is the Middle East and North Africa, the Arab Spring. And if you look at the scale, the in the way that all the imperialist pulverization of Yemen, of Syria, the of Sudan, the of Algeria, the the, the way that the of Iraq, the way that those movements in the Middle East, those big movements for democracy, they're also movements for food. They're movements for food in the midst of economic crisis and of climate crisis. And yes, we will have enormous repression, but I also think that, for instance, if there is South Africa, Mozambique, Angola are in the grip of long-term, very bad continuing droughts. If there was a mass march of peasants to the American embassy in one of those countries that said, with people saying, "You did this. We need grants now so we can survive. We need climate jobs. Help us. Pay for what you did." That the the United States government would be furious, but very, very, very many people in the United States would not be furious. Would respond to this, particularly African Americans, but much more broadly, would respond to this by saying, yes, help those people. I think we have to build a movement. We cannot build a movement that is just in the global South. It also has to be in the rich countries, because they are they are very, very large emitters. It has to be in both places. But yeah, I'll come back to your deep question in the end about the time scale, but we are embarked. The nice metaphor for it in my mind is it's like surfing a wave that is entirely bigger than you are. We are embarked on a historical process that could end in many different kinds of horror. And collectively, we have to ride this wave in the hope that we can come out. But there's a reason why the powers of the world have not done what needs to be done. There is a reason why they will try, but the reason we need to build movements in every country is so that what happens in India or South Africa or Bolivia has a resonance with people in the United States or Germany who are trying to do the same thing. That's only an answer to part of your question. We'll come back to the key one later.
I'll just bring in Barbara's questions now, Jonathan. Barbara has two questions for you, which are also in the chat box, so you can also take a look yourself. She has two questions about the powerful case you made for the state to coordinate jobs. She says, what happens in an economy where about 90% of the jobs are informal in nature, insecure livelihoods and on verbal contracts? Much of India's economy functions in the fashion below the regulative and legal radar and is out of the control of the state. That includes all the increasingly subcontracted labor in coal mining and all the illegal livelihoods around coal mining and the informal coal economy. So that's her first question. The second one is about, about the opposite trends. The rational case for state-led jobs confronts the opposite trends in market-driven politics in India. How is countervailing power to be built in the face of a hegemonic alliance of crony capital and quasi-fascist politics?
You want me to reply to those?
Yeah, you could please.
Okay. That is,
and
again, that's in a different way confronting the same issues as Sumati was confronting. Okay, the informal in nature. It's not given. It's not a given. It's not a given of the economy, and it's not a given of culture that the economy is so much dominated by the informal economy. In most countries in the world where mass trade unionism has been built, it was built by projects to turn an informal economy into a formal economy, to have security of work for factory workers, for dock workers, and so on. if you look at what's happened to labor in China, for instance, labor in China was very largely in a formal economy in 1965. Very large parts of it are now, in one way or another, in an informal economy, not on the scale of India. I think what's necessary is a struggle by unions for formal jobs, or at least secure jobs. Secure jobs with a secure rate of pay, and you turn up every day and you work, and also much less subcontracting. This is not only in India, this is more general. But also, I think there is a precedent for having formal jobs, for having a formal sector. There's the railways. There's the Indian Army. There are parts of the economy which still work in the formal sector. I think it's a twofold thing. It's a larger social structure for job security above all else, and it's the government embarking on this extension of the formal economy, because the distinction between informal and formal economies wreaks damage, as we all know, wreaks enormous damage in India. How the opposite trends in the market for hegemonic, that's in India, but the problem in India of the coming together of a neoliberal ruling class with a mass populist, racist, sexist, mass populist movement, which is semi-fascist, at least in some ways like old-fashioned fascism, but in other ways different. Above all else, the old-fashioned fascists could not recruit large working class constituencies, and much of the new fascists are able to do that. That's a problem also in Brazil, in the United States, in a different form in Britain, where I live, in the Philippines. That's a problem. The right wing, the serious populist, racist, sexist, hating right wing, is very strong in the world. And they're looking, their two main leaders of this are Modi and also Putin. These are the people who've developed this political model that other people are following. It's an enormous task that we have to turn around. But I don't think we can do it by saying, oh, we have to turn around these things before we have the climate action, before we organize the climate movement. I think what we're saying to people is we have to do this about climate. We have to do this about climate because actually there is no other way than reducing emissions. We can't think of another way of reducing emissions by 90% that does this. So we have to have this. If we build that movement, then that goes alongside the other struggles, but the other struggles can take strength from what people want to do about climate change. And the thing that keeps coming back to me is I read a blog piece by somebody who was the president of the student union at JNU. And I can't remember, it was 3 or 4 years ago. It was during the time when there was the big peasants march, small farmers march on Delhi. I can't remember what year it was. It was before the movement that came from the Punjab, but that movement. And the guy from JNU, he said it was very strange. He said, I talked to all of these farmers, and every single one of them told me about climate change. Every single one of them told me about what climate change meant for their livelihood, their working life. He said, and there was no general politics of climate change. There was no demand about climate change. It was not an issue for this movement, although it was an issue for every single person in this movement. And I think that part of what we need to do is the very important thing of just saying over and over again, every time the rain comes at the wrong time of year. And so we need to develop, we're at the stage of developing struggles, yes, but also a general political argument that brings where we go for, to put it in Marxist terms, which many of you use, where we go for the contradictions in the hegemony. And we also, I think also we see the hegemony beginning to come apart in various ways. We see the old hegemony of neoliberalism beginning to come apart. The center in more and more ways cannot hold. And that is not necessarily good news. That can be horrific. But I think we have to push at that. But that's not to denigrate the scale of the task that Sumati and Barbara are both talking about. That's that rant finished.
So Jonathan, I'll come into the question of you to respond my own before bringing a couple of questions from Arun Bidani. I wanted to, hear your thoughts about the climate movement as you see it now in different contexts and places. I mean, so for instance, in the US, in the United States, for instance, there's been a fairly strong and vibrant movement, the Sunrise Group, Sunrise Movement, Ocasio-Cortez, and yet we ended up in a situation where somebody like Bernie Sanders, somebody in a COVID context when jobs are going, and there's obviously climate crisis staring us in the face, did not even become the candidate for the Democratic Party. So you got that on the one hand. On the other hand, in Europe, there's been a lot of clearly young people sort of speaking out far more. But I mean, I just want to get a sense about where you see the climate movement now in different places, and are we still very strongly behind the curve? And do you feel that a time might arise where we are sort of not in that position, where we are sort of not way behind the curve as it seem to be at the moment? So that's just one for me. Arun Bidani asks you that you emphasize the importance of mass movements. He says he does agree, but are social movements built, or do they emerge in more complex ways? And above that, he sort of says, for any political movement to grow, it's essential that it addresses questions of inequality at all kinds of levels, including political inequality, as well as wealth and income. And the reality is that inequality has increased at every level over the last couple of decades in so many different places, and certainly economy. So would you like to address and respond to that?
Those two sets of questions now, yours and Arun's.
Okay.
Okay. The situation of the climate movement. The big answer is I'm not sure. And I'm not sure because the people in the climate movement are not sure. You can almost hear the sound. I mean, I see it most clearly in Europe and the United States, where I grew up and I still have a lot of contacts. You can hear the sound of people taking a deep breath and saying, oh. In the United States, Bernie didn't get there. Bernie didn't get the nomination, but compared to anything that had come before of a really progressive or democratic or nature in the United States, it was an enormous step forward. An enormous step forward. But the Democratic Party is a real force, and there is much further to go. And also, many people of color accepted the argument, which was a very strong argument, that they preferred Bernie's politics, they preferred what he would do, but they thought that white people were going to vote for Trump and that Biden was more likely, given what they knew of white people, Biden was more likely to get white people's votes, to put it brutally. And that stopping Trump and everything that Trump represented, stopping him in the era of Black Lives Matter, was of absolutely central importance. And that's why, so that's the good and the bad. But the larger thing now is that you can see over climate, but across the board, you can see the social movements in the United States understanding that they were waiting for Biden. They were waiting for Biden to act. And they were waiting for Biden to deliver policies that would be good for the lives of ordinary people in the United States. The lives of ordinary people in the United States are now getting worse. And Biden has not delivered the policies he promised. And he hasn't really campaigned for them. He's tried to make deals in Washington, but he doesn't really care. And all the people who are waiting for Biden are saying to themselves, oh, we have to take on Biden and the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and we have to take on the Republican Party, and we have to take on the corporations. And they're across a very wide range of issues, they are gearing themselves up to do this. But it's a very big thing to gear themselves up to do. You see the same process in some ways in Europe, where people again were waiting for Biden, were hoping that Biden would deliver something. And the stark knowledge now that what Greta Thunberg is saying, that we have to do it ourselves. We can do it ourselves, but we have to do it ourselves. We have to take on all that power. That's pushing in two directions. One is towards more activism and more serious activism, and the other is just a kind of paralysis. And so I don't know. I'm pretty sure where the balance of those leads in 4 years' time, it leads towards much more activism. How quickly that becomes the dominant force, I don't know. Arun, are movements built, or do they emerge in much more? They're not built by me, or you and me, or us on this call. Movements are built, but they're built by enormous numbers of people. Greta Thunberg went and sat by herself outside the Swedish embassy. Greta Thunberg is a major figure in the movement now because millions of other school children globally did the same thing. Those people, the people who followed her, they built the movement. And many different movements flow into the same movement. The reason there's a Green New Deal proposal in the United States is that Ocasio-Cortez, who was elected as an economic progressive, had been to the Native American protests against pipelines in South Dakota. And she had understood from that experience the importance of environmentalism and then generalized to climate change. These things, they flow at best they flow together. Millions of people. We can't build a movement. People like you and me, people with a set of political arguments, we can't build a movement. But inside a growing movement, we have sufficient weight if we try and involve as many people as possible. We have sufficient weight to make a particular argument within that movement. To make an argument about jobs and an argument about equality and an argument about having to build from below. That we can make within a much larger movement. But whether that much larger movement exists, we can't will that. We can only hope. Do I have time, Nagraj, to take on the point about equality?
Yeah, certainly do. Yeah.
Enormously important. Enormously important. I think what we've failed, what the old left, in a sense, has failed to take on is the importance of the way that all the inequalities go together. If you look at the global populist right, they put all the inequalities together. If you look at Modi or Putin or Trump, or Duterte, you see people who are in favor of corporate rule and corporate power. You see people who mobilize on that basis, but the the sexism, the support for sexual violence, the support for sexual harassment, the use of sexual violence in pogroms and so on, front and center of their politics. Racism, front and center. Islamophobia, in every case, front and center. The different kinds of inequality, they do a very complex job where they mobilize the people who are on the receiving end of inequality, the people who are suffering, to have inequality towards other people. And we cannot fight this. We have to fight this. Firstly, we have to fight this as an economic thing. We have to say very clearly, socialism is not about having countries where the cadres make 10 times the wages of ordinary workers. That's not what socialism is. But more important, we have to fight for a whole series of demands that are about economic equality, class equality, but all the others we have to fight about at the same time. And if you take the Indian example, trade unionism is real in India. The last general strike was real and important. But look at the importance of the moment in 2019 when the movement by Muslims and by non-Muslims and by students against Islamophobia, when that movement came together with the Dalit organizations in UP and Haryana. The catastrophe, in a sense, for Hindutva that moment was. Look again at the small farmers from the Punjab. That was a movement of agricultural workers and a movement of the people who employed agricultural workers. That was a movement of people led by people who many people would dismiss as the petty bourgeoisie. But it was a movement against the inequality between small farmers and agribusiness and international corporations that, again, was crucial. These things are crucial for weakening a generalized project of inequality. And if you just say, well, class is all that matters, you are lost in this struggle. They will put you in a box and get rid of you. If you just say all of these struggles matter and class doesn't, you're lost again. I think we have to do both. And I think that it is wonderful that the argument for equality across the board is winning so strongly, and that the new movements that you can see, and I include the Indian farmers movement and the Islamophobia movement in that, but also the Arab Spring in Thailand and Burma and Hong Kong and Black Lives Matter in the United States and Chile and Bolivia. All of these movements, you see not just class movements, but you see that women are everywhere. Women are everywhere, and on the ground, in the occupations, on the streets, groups of women are leading. You see everywhere that the people who've been excluded from the political process, the people who are excluded from the social process, are suddenly, as in Black Lives Matter, but as in the Dalit and Muslim movement and so on in India, these people are moving to the center. And that the views on these issues by people under 30, and particularly people under 25, are very, very different from the views of people of my age. These things are encouraging. Yeah. Next.
Yeah, Shavik, this may possibly be the last question. Shavik wanted to come in. Yeah, Shavik.
Yeah, I had a very brief question to Jonathan. This is regarding your observations about the movement and your involvement with the trade union movement. So is there a possibility, or do you see any coalition happening between the trade unions across the globe like between the North and the South? Because given that the climate crisis is a global problem, do you think that any such possible collaboration or coalition might happen to fight this, given your experience? Because I also agree with you. I have seen some of the trade union movements here with our experience that they have become more receptive in the US about the idea of climate change and starting to negotiate. Even the coal workers trade unions have started to, given they're discussing about the transition packages, which I think would not have been imagined even maybe 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. So given this, do you think that any coalition can happen globally across the borders? Thank you. Thank you for your time, and it's a brilliant talk. Thank you.
Okay, international trade union politics.
Jonathan,
Should I take another question, Nagraj?
yeah. There is one that is coming from Aditi. So she'd like to hear your responses or your comments and thoughts on the rise of indigenous communities in various places, both in India, both by Adivasi movements here and by indigenous communities in other parts of the world. Maybe you could respond to both.
Okay. Yeah.
Response.
Let me start with the trade union movement. International trade union politics is a funny thing. There is a tendency in every country for when all the unions come together and the Trade Union Congress or the AFL-CIO in America or the shifting coalitions in India, there's a tendency to push the demands again and again down to the lowest common denominator, which doesn't mean international trade union work is not important. I've done work for the International Transport Workers Federation, which I think was very useful, and much more work has been done in that federation. Before the Paris COP, the Global Climate Jobs campaigns held a joint meeting in Paris with the ITUs, the International TUC, which was very good. It's important to work on that level, but it's not the central level to work at, because our experience with unions in every country where we've built union coalitions for climate jobs in one way or another, in New York State, for a time in Canada, in the Basque Country, in Portugal, in Norway, in Britain, in South Africa. Our experience there has been basically that we can get about half the unions officially agreeing with us. And we tend to do better with the half of unions where there's simply obvious benefits for their members, like transport workers unions. And with unions which basically it's not going to affect their job particularly, like teachers and postal workers. It's more difficult to build in industries that are committed to the old high carbon economy. That's more difficult. We've certainly done it in different places, particularly Canada for a time, and South Africa for a time was where it was done best. But everywhere it has to be a combination of getting individual unions to support it and getting branches and local organizations in other unions to support it. You have to, you can't do it as the whole trade union movement, is my experience so far. Although I think if we moved to having a national one-day strike about it, then we could probably get almost everybody in. That's but the trade union solidarity between North and South, I think we have to build that. And I think that's part of what a climate jobs movement has to build by bringing people back and forth. We're trying to have, on a very low level, we're trying to have an international climate jobs conference on Zoom for 3 days in early June. And we're doing that because above all else, we want to get local trade union activists and local trade union branches from all over the world giving small panels, talking to each other. But I think as our movements grow, what we've got to do is send speakers back and forth and send speakers from struggles that are environmental by unions, but also from struggles that aren't environmental by unions to other countries, sort of on one level just to raise money to keep the strike going, but on another level to build the kind of internationalism that used to be there in the workers' movement that has very largely disappeared. That's a partial answer to that question. The indigenous. I don't know as much about Adivasi movements. The indigenous movements in the Americas, Latin America and North Canada and the United States, particularly Canada and Latin America, have been very important. They've been very important because they the whole climate movement globally was very demoralized by the result of the Copenhagen climate talks in 2009. That was an enormous setback, and the climate movement globally was just flat for about 3 years. And then we had the movements against the pipelines and against fracking by the First Nations indigenous communities in Canada, who are, many of whom are based in villages, really, very small towns and villages, in actual communities. And they turned out, non-violently, but singing the old warrior songs, they turned out and they stopped they stopped a lot of the fracking, and they stopped some of the pipelines, and that then spread to the United States, to indigenous communities in the United States, and that all over the world, that gave the climate movement, particularly in Europe and North America, it lifted us off the floor. In another way, environmentally, the movements in Latin America have been enormously important, particularly around the forest people in the Brazilian Amazon, but also in Ecuador and Peru and so on, and the movements of the indigenous people in Chile and Argentina about the lithium mines and so on. But more generally and globally, the movements against extractivism. These have been enormously important, and these are very brave and very dangerous. The grassroots leaders are being killed all the time because what they're doing is so important. And I think that a climate jobs movement has to reach out to those people in two obvious ways. One is jobs. One is, this is very important in India, but I think more generally, the Narmada movement is, in my understanding, unimaginable without the Adivasi people. that was the heart of it. And what we can't have, I think, what's not going to work in India is a movement for more big hydro. It's for those reasons it's not going to work. But also, I think we have to think of this. I'm saying particularly to environmentalists, we have to think in an entire. People are coming from outside the Adivasi communities, outside the community. I'm just talking about the forest Adivasis now, globally. Those movements, what happens is an NGO comes in and takes it over. A sustainable NGO comes in, and the sustainable NGO people are paid 20 and 50 times what the forest people are making. Do you know what I mean? And that's sort of, and then we empower them, which is to say we take away their power. And I think the Adivasi movements are real, and they're also in India very often connected with the miners. Do you know what I mean? That's another reason for promising jobs to everybody who's working informally in the mines. I think we have to say forestry is very important, but that does not mean the removal of the forest people under cover of biodiversity. It means the forest people living there with proper schools, proper medical care, proper education for their own people, so their own people can provide these services, and political control of the forests and being paid to keep the forests there. But the simple answer is the indigenous people in general have been an enormous inspiration to all the rest of us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. I think that's a very positive way to.
Nagaraj, Nagaraj, I have a
Ah,
word.
and Vivi, yeah, come in, please. Yeah, that will be the last question, please. Ajab.
Yeah, yeah. Jonathan,
Yes.
um, you see, this on this question which Sumati had asked about the time factor.
Mm.
See, I've been doing a lot of research on this and know the background. Uh, the thing is that I now believe that every generation going forward is going to see a 1 degree rise in temperature. I mean, leave out this 1.5 and 2 nonsense and so on. You see, we have seen 1 degree and beyond. Our children are going to see the next degree. Our grandchildren are going to see the 3rd degree. And unfortunately, I disagree with you. It's not going to stop over there. And I'm saying this on the basis of what the climate science is showing, which really means that we don't know where it's going to end. The temperature rise that are already there because it becomes self-propagating. Now, that leads me to the second part. So 1 generation, 1 degree is this thing, and you could roughly say, 3 generations per century kind of thing. So we don't know where it's going to stop. And if we don't know where it's going to stop, then where I disagree with you is on the optimism, pessimism question. Is that it's not going to be millions or even hundreds of millions of losses of life. If you see, starting from now going forward, there's probably going to be billions. Now, all of it may not get officially attributed to climate change. You might have wars, you might have violence and so on, but the underlying causes are going to be related to climate change. And it's going to be billions. So you might see a peaking of the world population maybe around 2045, 2050, and after that, the crash is going to start. Right? And we'll be told various stories, various reasons, and so on. I mean, James Lovelock is on record as saying, I think in his book, Revenge of Gaia, that the world population might crash to as little as 100 million people. Now, okay, even if you take that as an outside estimate and so on, but it is a very, very serious problem. And this is something that we have to communicate, which goes way beyond politics, just of movements and jobs and so on. This is the seriousness that I would like to really see coming into this discourse going forward. What is your view on this?
Shall this be the last thing I say, Nagraj? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try and answer that question and come back to the most important part of Sumati's question, which I was dodging because I was holding it till the end. It's on the timing. Sanjeev, I think Lovelock is wrong, and I think there's no math, there's no arithmetic in Lovelock's book. It's just a statement. But I think you're probably right about 1 degree per generation, more or less, and that's the course that we're on. And also, I don't want you to come away from this talking thinking that you're pessimistic and I'm optimistic. I go back and forth. And at night, in the dark, I'm very frightened and pretty hopeless. When I go to meetings and marches of people who are trying to do something about climate change, I believe there's an alternative. And otherwise, I veer back and forth. I don't know. I don't know if we're going to do it. It's helpful. It encourages me to think that the political views of the generation that's coming up, of the people under 25, and especially the people under 18, are very different. But I don't know. And I think I don't think that I don't think it will be billions, but maybe it will be. But for me, 500 million dead would be bad enough. Um, I am, and I, on the timing, there is the question of the timing. If business as usual continues, what nature does, what physics does, and that we really don't know, Samati. We really don't know because we're dealing with nonlinear processes that have not happened in this form before. And that's all guesswork, really. I'm pretty sure we have another 10 years, and maybe we have 20, and maybe we have 40. We don't know. And how quickly we can build this mass movement, I don't know. We're talking about something on the scale of the anti-colonial movement. From the explosion of Congress in 1919 to 1948 is 29 years. We're talking about something on the scale of building the trade union movement globally. We're talking about building the social democratic movement that won the welfare state in Europe, which was 40, 50 years. Or the movements that won the vote first for men, all men, and then for women, which again, we're talking about building a movement on that scale. And those movements started with relatively small groups of people who thought this had to be done, and therefore they could not remain small groups of people. So that's the scale. The fact that opinions are changing, but also the fact that climate change is becoming more and more and more obvious, is that increases the ability that we have to struggle. But we're also talking about transforming our movements, transforming all the kinds of social movements, environmental movements we're in, transforming them because we have to do this. We can no longer be commenting and analyzing. We actually have to do this. And also transforming them by bringing all kinds of different, finding all kinds of different people and allying with them and following them and seeing how they build and what they build. But also, sometimes when I'm desperate at night, I also think to myself that we're also building for the moment of runaway climate change. When runaway climate change comes, there will be an enormous political argument in those moments as it's different countries, enormous political argument. And in that argument, the arguments for sacrifice and inequality and dictatorship will be very strong. If we have built a movement that says, no, there is another way, we can do this by sharing, we can do this by taking care of each other, we can do this by letting the refugees in. If we've been making that argument for long enough and big enough that millions and millions of people have heard that argument before, they don't know the details, but they know that argument is there, then people like us will have earned the right to be part of every discussion and every argument about this. At that moment, if we can't do it before then, but if we can build a big enough movement before then, we will be able at that moment to argue for a different future. So when I think about that, I think both that we're trying to win this now and that if not in the future. The last thing I want to say though is about India. I think there is enormous space for making the kind of argument adapted to, and improved and so on, but for making this kind of argument in India, in the environmental movement, but in the Adivasi movement, in the Dalit movement, in the trade union movement. We can't make people, groups as small as can't possibly make those movements, but we can make those arguments known within those movements. That seems to me over the next few years to be a possible thing to do. And thank you very, very, very much, everybody, particularly Nagraj, but everybody for the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, no, it's
Thanks.
us
Thank you.
thanking you, Jonathan, for also such a wide-ranging discussion and responses, which I think I thought was so enriching. And also, it's sort of infused with sort of hope, I think. Sort of, that I think that's really, really important. Because it is a very bleak reality. I don't think it's as bleak as Lovelock says. I don't entirely agree with Lovelock. But it is a very challenging reality as climate crisis sort of unfolds, every passing month now. And I think the centrality in that sense of jobs, which I think is so essential to the argument. In fact, Shavik, who's present here, wrote a paper about this in the EPW about how renewables can provide far more jobs per unit of investment compared to coal, etc. And I think that argument about jobs is so central to our arguments going forward. So, and I'm glad that Mohit has. Thank you for being able to upload your book, download your book, Jonathan. Mohit has provided the link in the chat box for those who are interested in reading Jonathan's book. But Jonathan, it's just been lovely having you. Thank you very much, and do please stay in touch. I will be in touch and talk more with the teachers group and maybe get it more in touch with more people elsewhere and so on. That would be very nice. So that's really thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Shavik, for hosting. Yeah. And now, shall I, Shavik, now stop the recording? Yeah.
Yes, I'm doing that.